So even if you're an experienced quilter, this is a really nice pattern to do when you need a quick, easy gift, something that you can do in a Saturday afternoon and finish it up Sunday. So what I'm going to do first, I have my 2.5-inch strips, and then I went ahead and got a couple yards of some different coordinating fabrics because I want to put in a border, and also I'm not sure which one I'm going to use, but I've got this here that could be a nice skinny stop border around the main quilt, and then possibly this one here, or I might choose this for the larger outside border. So before we get started, I have to take my prints and I have to section them out into groups of 5. So I'm going to take lights and darks and I'm going to group them into 5 strips each, which I will sew all together. So I'm going to separate them by lights and darks, and I'm also going to look at pattern, because if I have the same pattern with maybe one has a light background and one has a dark background, I still don't want to take that same, say this floral pattern. I don't want to put 2 strips with that same pattern in the same row. So I will section it all out and come back together in just a bit and show you what I've come up with. So what we're trying to do here is we're going to have 8 groups of 5 strips, and then I will sew them all together in long strips. I'm going to lay them out, cut them into 10-inch segments, so I'll have 10-inch squares, and then I'm going to put them back together again to create rows. So I have these separated here so I can see what I'm working with, and I'm just going to quickly pick like a light and a dark, and then another light. So I have 3, a dark. Let's use this dark one here. And put a light in the middle. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, I have my sets ready. I have 8 sets of 5, and there were a lot of butterflies in this. So I did have one grouping of 5 that has 2 butterflies, but not too bad. So I've got them set with each group has at least one of the hot pinks, and tried to get 2 relatively dark or mediums with some lights. So I think I've got a pretty good pairing. And now I'm going to take these over to my sewing machine, and I'm just going to sew them from end to end. So I'll take the first one in the stack, put the second one next to it. Don't worry about these serrated edges. Sometimes people are concerned. That can go, just put them right together, and that's part of your 1/4 inch. And I'm going to take it and I'm going to sew it, remembering which one, I've already forgotten, was on the end. So this is what might be a good idea, is to put a little pin on the one that is on the outside. So once I start, I'll remember. So I'm sewing this end together, and then I will keep going. See you in a few. My Baby Lock Brilliant makes this really easy to do. It keeps everything going through the machine nice and steady. I just have to make sure on this end over here that I've got them lined up together, and it's going to go right through with no bunching. It's not going to pull my fabrics at all. And you really really don't need to put a back stitch in here because you're going to cut all these. So I have my first 2 strips. I put my pin in this side. So I know this is the corner, so I'm going to put my next one on here. Okay, so I am a little over halfway done with my strip sets. I did find, as I started sewing, that I actually move my serrated edge over just a little bit, so I'm really cutting that out when I sew it. It doesn't really matter how you do it as long as you stay consistent throughout, so that they come out the same. When I add the new one on, I want to make sure that I fully open up the last one so I don't have it folded over. Get it straight on top. See how I've got it a little outside there. Reset. And begin again. I really have liked putting my pin in the first strip at the top. It has kept me from having to figure out which side I'm to add the next strip onto. It's made it a lot easier for me. This is the first time I've used that trick and I really like it. Fold this out, get this so that it all hangs down evenly without catching on anything. This is the last in this group of 5. And then I have 3 more groups of 5 to do. And then I will show you how to cut these into 10-inch squares. The big thing, as you can see, with stripping these together, it's going to be really important that I do a good ironing job on it, because we've got to get it to lay flat. These will all need to be pressed so that they lay flat. If you don't do a great job of ironing, it can kind of narrow on you and you won't get a square. But don't get real hung up on these edges here. What you really want to look for is when you're done, you want to look at this side and you want to flip it over and look at this side, see if you can see the other fabric poking through. I've got a little bit over here, but that's not enough to make any difference. If I had too skinny of a seam there, I could always just put it back through, put a little back stitch in, and re-sew so that I made sure that I had a good seam allowance in there. So this one is all done. 3 more to go. Okay, so now we have all of our strip sets completed, and we have to take this and iron it so that it looks like this. You can tell when I pull on it, I don't have folds. Everything is ironed flat. And look at the back side. Typically, when we iron, we will iron our seam away from the light side. But on something like this, there's enough print. It's really easiest on this to iron it all to one side or the other. It will lay much easier that way when we iron. So we're gonna start at the top. I can just run my hand down to make sure the seam is going this way. And now iron it over. Keep that seam going to the left. can take out my pen. Don't need that anymore. I want to just slightly tug on it so that I make sure that I open my seam up all the way. I can use a little best press, crisp up my fabric a little. Last little bit. Now, I always want to make sure I turn it over and check my seams to make sure that they are, kind of like to iron this side too, all going the same way. If you have something that has been flipped over and ironed the other way, put a little best press on it and re-iron it in the direction you want it to go. It really will make a difference when you are matching your seams together. If you have things crooked like this, it kind of distorts your seam line. So you want to make sure it's all nicely pressed down to one side. And this one's all done. So once your iron is all done, we're going to lay these out and cut them into 10.5-inch squares. So if you can tell, when I've got this laying down, it's leaning to one side, and that's okay. I can kind of straighten it up as I go. If you have a 10.5-inch ruler, that is perfect for this. I'm just going to use my little ruler here. I'm going to start on the end, make sure that I can see my mark on the table. And I'm going to trim. Go down to 10.5. And next cut will be 21. Move these aside. Pull this up. And since it was a little uneven here, I can kind of even it back out. I use this to get my straight edge here. I have to come down to 21, so I'm going to pull this down as far as I can there, so I don't cut too much of my selvage in. Come back down here and trim this. You can see here, I've got a little bit of the selvage, but when I put my ruler down, it's within 1/4 inch. So that is going to be inside the seam and will be okay. I need to not forget to cut it at the 10.5 here. Now I'm going to turn each one and lay it down on the table again. I'm looking at the 10.5-inch mark where I'm going to cut, and I want to smooth it out. So I cut just a little bit over each side. So this square is now a 10.5 by 10.5-inch square. And I'll continue until I have all of my squares cut. I want to make sure this is relatively even so that I don't cut. You don't want to square this exactly up and end up taking a whole 1/4 inch off of one side. You want to cut a little off of each side so that you still retain your 2 inches on each of the strips. Okay, so now I have all of my 10.5-inch squares cut. You'll have 42. You're only going to need 40. So 2 of the pieces you can take out. I had one row that was really kind of not very straight. So I clipped out the good section, and I'm gonna just get rid of that so that I have my 40 pieces that are all nice and square. Patterns will generally tell you to randomly sew together your 2.5-inch strips. And if you remember at the beginning of this, I didn't randomly sew anything together. I'm a little OCD when it comes to this, and I like there to be some type of pattern. I feel like if you are a little more, take just a little bit more time and select which fabrics to sew together, you'll have a better balanced quilt, and it will be a little more pleasing to the eye than if you truly just randomly start stripping things together, which is why I really planned it out and decided which 5 strips I was going to sew together as I started. And I'm going to do the same thing at this point. Here you're going to be sewing rows of 5, and you will have 6 rows. So I want to select which ones are next to each other, because I don't want to have the same strip right next to itself or below it. I want to have this, say this one, for example, I want to have that spread out evenly on my quilt. And so I have regrouped everything. So I've got all them grouped together. I should have 4 of each. And now I'm going to kind of design my quilt. I'll want each one to be in the row only one time. So that it just flows a little bit better that way. So I'm going to do some little designing here and put together my sections of 5, and then I will sew them together and can sew my rows together. Okay, so I don't want to get too fussy about this. I want to keep it pretty simple, but I want to put a little thought into it. So this is how my first row will lay out. And my thought process in going through this, I wanted this strength here, the bouquet, right side up at the top left of my quilt, so that will be nice. I've got some of the darker pink, the hot pink. I've got one here, 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 and here. So it's kind of spread out. The really white, this wording here and here. I wouldn't want these 2 right next to each other. So one thing that I would want to avoid is, say, doing this, because I'm going to have these right next to each other. So I'm once again looking at lights and darks so that I get a nice balance with each row. So I'll do this for all of my rows, and then I'm going to once again look at the colors and the patterns on the fabrics before I decide which rows to put next to each other. So I don't have to design the whole quilt out right now. I just have to do each row. And I'll certainly have enough variance to have the rows go together nicely when I'm done, because I'll have 6 different rows. All right. Okay, so I'm putting my last row together, and I have 2 blocks that are very similar. These 2 here, they both start with this pretty pink butterfly. And so I'm going to use this at the beginning, and then I'll take this one, use it at the end, but I'm going to turn it and have that be the sideways, so they will not both be going straight up in the quilt. so that will make it look a little different. On this quilt pattern, you're going to turn each block. So one straight up and down, the next one will be sideways. Straight up and down, and then sideways again. I have to put mine together into my stacks, and I have put a pin through each stack. That will make it easier when I sew these together so I don't mix up my groups. This jelly roll has a lot of wording in it. So usually I don't pay too much attention to it, but I do want to, if I can, have these words going right side up and not upside down on the quilt. They will have to go sideways, and that's okay. But as I'm putting it together, I'm making sure that when I have one that's going like this, that I have my words going the right direction. Okay, so I take my pin out from my stack, and I'm gonna put it in the left side corner so I keep straight what I'm doing here. This is gonna go on top of here. Now, when I turn it over to sew, I don't want to sew. So a lot of times when I'm starting a strip, I'll go ahead and put a back stitch in, and that way I can maneuver the fabric without it slipping out. I've got a little tension on it. I want to get this right like that. This works great because I'm sewing these down instead of if I was sewing it this way. You don't want to be sewing across like this because you will flip these over. So I've got this down. I have my back stitch in because these have already been cut. We're not going to cut them again. You do want that back stitch in to keep it from coming undone as you continue to work with the fabric with the back stitch in the bottom. I've got my pin so I know which way is which one is the first one, so I don't accidentally sew them together wrong. My next piece is going to go like this. Now, see how this ends up with me sewing it the way I don't want? I can just flip it upside down, get my corners together, lay it down, put in my back stitch. Now I can even out everything out. Stop here. Get this a little more even. Back stitch. This is why having this pin in here is so handy, because I'm turning it around, and that way I don't forget which one is the start and which one I need to sew the next piece to. Today is a beautiful day on the lake, and I really am so fortunate to have such a nice area to sew in. A lot of times I'm sewing at the island and standing and sewing, but today Mark has this table set up for me so I can sit and enjoy the lake view as I sew, sitting down. So we're going to jump ahead and show you what your rows will look like before you start sewing them together. We have the first block is horizontal, and then the next block is going to be turned vertically, and so on throughout the row. As you're creating your rows, you need to make sure that every other one, your first block, is alternating. So first row, it's horizontal, second row is vertical, third row is going to be horizontal, and so forth. Okay, so we have all of our rows sewed together, And now once you have ironed where you have sewn your blocks together, get them nice and flat, you need to lay them out and decide which rows are going to go in what order. I like to, once again, look at balance and make sure that I don't have like this block. It starts with the white background with the script on it. And, you know, I wouldn't want to have that same strip at the beginning, you know, every couple rows. If you notice, we've got it spread out among the quilt so that I have some balance in my lights and darks, but also in the design, the florals, and the scripts. So I've laid it out. You can place them over each other as you lay them out. You can still get a good idea of the overall look of the quilt, and this allows you to get it all on your table at one time if you don't have a design wall that you can put them up on. So we've got them laid out. I like my placement. I still have my pins in the top left corner, and before I sew these together, I'm going to mark these with my row numbers so that I don't get out of order and mess up my placement. In keeping things really simple and easy, I just took a piece of scrap fabric and I marked on it my numbers and put them on my rows. This way I can keep them straight. Hopefully. If this is your first quilt, I'm going to show you how to put your rows together. So you're going to lay them out, row 1 and row 2, and you're going to lay row 2 over row 1. That way you make sure you don't turn one upside down. And then you're going to find where your blocks come together. You're going to nest your seams. You can see that. I've got one that's going sewn ironed to the right and one that's ironed to the left. I'm going to put a pin in there. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to pin, I've got to move my number out of the way. I'm going to pin the end.
Or clip.
I'm going to go back and get my next point where the two meet up and nest those together. And pin. So like this here, I'll want to go back and iron this going back in this direction. It will lay better. Then I'm going to come and pin in the middle of these two. And I want to pin over here also. There in the middle. Your thin pins work really well for this. On your pins, the bigger the head, the thicker the pin is. So this is a big quilting pen. It's got a really large head and it's very thick, really tiny head, very thin needle. I like using the thin ones when I'm putting rows together. Find where this meets. I'm going to pull this up. I want these to be even. Put my pin in. Go back now and pin the middle. You want to do on the squares where they meet first and pin that. Got it nested because you can tug it, get it right in place. This one's going to have to be re-ironed to the left so that they nest nicely together like that. See that? Then after I can even out the middle and do the end. One more pin. Pull that up. Nice and even. And I am ready to take this to my sewing machine and seam this, and then I'll just continue. This row will come down. I'll put row 3 here, flip it on top, and pin and sew until all 6 are done. As you're sewing the rows together, it can get a little tricky. The back side, you want to make sure that these two fabrics stay together. You've got a lot of bulk, the more rows that you add, so you want to make sure you keep that up and out of the way. It's not a bad idea to reach your hand under and grab the bottom side and tug at it, if need be, to get these two to lay straight. See how it's getting off? So I'm gonna just stop, reset. Pull that bottom piece. You wanna make sure that these go under. Once again, pull that piece up. Where they come together, they tend to slide. And then when you're all done with that row, it's really important that you check the back side and make sure that you don't have too much of the front side coming over. That like this. That right there, I've got a really skinny seam. I need to go ahead and just take this little section out and re-sew that so that it's nice and even. Right. So our pretty day on the lake has turned a little bit oh, there's 2 hummingbirds. Do you see them out there? Right outside the window. We just had a big storm roll through, but it looks like it's finishing up. But the hummingbirds are back at the feeders. All right, so back to our quilting. So after you've got all your rows together, you have to iron. And I hate ironing, and anytime I can get out of ironing, I will. But do not skip this step. It's very important that you iron your seams after they're sewn down. You can wait and do it all at one time, but you have to do it before you're done. You need a quilt that's gonna lay flat in order to quilt it. It's also a good time to find things that you may wanna fix. Take a look at your seams and spend a few extra minutes fixing those if needed. Right here, you can see this seam here. It flipped over this way, and I really want it to go back the other way. It's gonna bunch a little there. And my seam's not gonna lay flat because of the way that that's folded. So it's really easy to fix. If I put on my glasses, I just have to clip about 2-3 threads. I can turn that seam the other way. Take it back to my machine, and I just have to sew just that little bit, and I will have a much flatter, better seam, and I'll be happier with the end product. Oh, thank you. Okay, so now back to ironing. One more row to go, and this will be all ironed.